episode of Dragons on the Wall, IGN's Game of Thrones show. This is our full series look back episode where we will be discussing the events of season 8 as well as the best and worst of Game of Thrones as a whole. So, obviously it goes without saying we are going to be talking spoilers, but also if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, what are you doing on this full look back episode? This is not the place for you. I, as always, am your host, Terri Schwartz, and this week we have two very special guests visiting us from Fandom.com, Eric Goldman.
Hello, we have returned.
And Roth Cornett.
Hello, happy to invade.
We are so happy that you returned to us. Our OG Dragons on the Wall members, our founders for this show. Thank you for this amazing legacy you've given for us. But also, we brought back our IGN cast members for this season, Jim Vejvoda.
I am not the king in the north, but thanks for having me.
Joshua Yale.
That's not me.
And Laura Prudhomme, our reviewer.
Burn them all.
Well, everyone, I know we had our look back at the season 8 finale. I know you as well over at Screen Junkies and Fandom did that as well. But we want to talk about season 8 as a whole. We've had about a day to digest the finale, so it'll all still be pretty fresh. But Roth and Eric, I'm curious, starting with you, what did you think about this season as a way to cap off a show we were all very passionate about?
Not my favorite. I'm going to definitely say that I'm not one of those people who say because I didn't like the finale, the series is ruined for me. Not at all. I'm sure we'll be talking about that a lot. But this final season, and I was someone who defended season 7 a lot more than some people. It had its problems, but I still was like, no, this is still really good. But this season, it just felt off. After that great second episode, it just felt like, they were rushing through things. I think that's a common complaint, but just the events that happened weren't the complaint as much as how they got there and the fact that things that should have taken maybe 4 episodes were happening like scene to scene. So it's a disappointing end to a show I love, but I still love the show.
Yeah. I largely agree. I think that for me it's ultimately, and we'll be talking about this a little bit too, but if you think about Ned Stark as a character in that first season, which to me is nearly perfect, and you think about the commitment, I think a lot of people, even myself, maybe have mischaracterized the brilliance of that, which it isn't that no one's safe and so boo, you could be surprised. And it isn't that it's subverting expectations, so it certainly did. It's that for me, I think George R. R. Martin saw that in literature and film, and certainly in television, he'd had experiences in TV that made him very unhappy about the way stories were being told, that a protagonist would paint themselves into a corner, and I talked about this a little bit last night, and then deus machina them their way out through an invisible wall. And what he wanted to do was set up a series of circumstances in which there was no way out, even if you're the protagonist. And so really he was committed to seeing through the truthful through line of every given character. They would act as themselves. They would not betray their given nature. Even in an evolution, you are who you are, and you will pay the price if you make mistakes, which he did. He could have left King's Landing. He chose not to do that. What happened in this last season for me is that plot took the reins of the dragon, and character was a little bit betrayed, and that thesis, it wasn't that I needed main characters to die just to shock me. Right. And I don't actually like the subversion of expectations just to subvert them, because that's not great storytelling either, and you can also see that coming. I wanted them to stay true to what would happen and how people would behave in the circumstances that they had set up on the show, not necessarily that will be set up in the books. So that was a diatribe.
No, that was so well said, though, and I think that's true. I think that ties back to kind of Daenerys' arc as well, and why people maybe were generally understood. Yes, we can see the way that she was projected to be a villain. She was on this trajectory, but the way the show kind of stuck the landing there didn't have kind of those important elements that led us in understanding this character to that point. Instead, it was, as you said, plot took us there by need of plot, and there was no character support to kind of justify it.
Yeah, there's a difference between, I'm sorry, you started it, man. There's really a difference between foreshadowing and telegraphing. Right. And so the Red Wedding was foreshadowed, and Ned's fate was foreshadowed, which meant that we got there and it felt both surprising and inevitable. That's what we want. Telegraphing, different story altogether.
Yeah. Oh, those crypts, they're the safest place in Winterfell.
Yeah.
Because then
guys.
Then it's like not surprising and unearned.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, Laura, you have been hard at work on the season 8 review, so you have had more time than many of us to digest. What are your thoughts overall? You've been reviewing for IGN.
Oh, God.
That's it.
To put it in a non-eloquent fashion, most of my feelings remain the same of the episode, of the season as a whole. It's been very up and down for me. There are certainly episodes and scenes and moments that I loved. I think, to Eric's point, episode 2 was the last time that I really felt satisfied with the show and what it's been doing and the kind of character beats that were paid off. And everything since then has just felt very rushed and just unsatisfying. I kind of said it last night that I just felt nothing watching the finale, and that's not how I wanted this show to go. Yeah. I expected to cry or feel something. Like, we've lived with these characters for so long that I am certainly invested in them, so you would think that I would have a visceral reaction to saying goodbye to them, even with some happy endings, but I really felt nothing at all, and that's a very sad legacy for me for the show. It certainly doesn't tarnish, as Eric said, what has come before. I will certainly continue rewatching the show periodically, especially the first kind of 4 seasons, which I adore. But it certainly leaves kind of a bad taste in the mouth.
And Joshua, you actually, before the final episode, went back and rewatched the entire season to that point. And what you said in our last episode was your feelings also remain the same about kind of the rush job.
Yeah, I thought maybe if I looked back on it as a whole and then it would all smoothly transition into what they were building to, and it would be a great send-off for the show in the final episode. No. It still feels like the show has been stuck on fast forward really since like season 6. I think that's around the time when they decided, hey, we're going to start going towards an ending, and they had that in sight. And ever since that happened, I think sort of to what Roth was saying, it's been less about like letting the characters drive and letting the plot take over, and that's why a lot of people are doing things that kind of felt rushed or out of character, and because they were just in a hurry to check off the next box along the plot, and not really taking the time to let us sit and have those amazing like Game of Thrones like conversations and everything. Season 8 really just felt like more of the same of the show being a shadow of its former self. I don't think it was ever going to really suddenly recapture the magic of the first several seasons that really enraptured everybody and made everybody such a big Game of Thrones fan. I still am a fan of Game of Thrones and do love the show overall and what it gave us. But yeah, I'd be kidding myself if I said that, I was really satisfied with the ending. And also, as far as the ending goes, I think that I actually was really holding out on it for it to pull like a Lost. I was very dissatisfied with seasons 4, 5, and 6 of Lost. I really thought it just lost its way, kind of like Game of Thrones. But in the finale of Lost, it really found its footing and found a way to make a really emotionally compelling finale to everything that had happened before, really bring it all full circle. Game of Thrones did not do that. Like Laura was saying, I didn't really feel any emotions. There were some things I really appreciated, had some cool moments here and there, but ultimately I thought some characters got like screwed over, some were like underserviced, some things just didn't make sense because they were rushing through it so fast.
Where's Mira?
And then Mira didn't show up. But then ultimately, there are some things I did like, but ultimately pretty disappointed with how it all shook out.
Now, Jim, with your fancy new microphone, where did that come from? Magic. Like Game of Thrones, we can just make things happen, and there doesn't need to be a rhyme or reason.
A smoke monster baby.
No. What is it? Have you thought of this season? You come from the perspective of not really being a book reader and not having that source material.
Yeah, I mean, I largely echo the sentiments of my fellow panelists. What I will say, I'm going to make a couple of probably awkward analogies. I'd like to think of this as like any other sort of long-term relationship. You want to remember the good years. Mm-hmm. And then when you get to the end, you do remember that actual breakup moment and it sucked. But with time that fades and you do just remember the good things. And that's kind of how I feel about Game of Thrones right now. I could see that the end was coming and it wasn't going to be, that the good years were behind us and it was time for it to end. So another awkward analogy, I'm also an Elvis fan. And for me, it's like, you want to remember the 50s Elvis when he was cool and kind of counterculture and badass and everyone liked him. And then you kind of get to the 60s and he gets a little mainstream. And then by the 70s, you're like, oh boy, that is not the dude we followed, you know? And so it's kind of like that. But overall, I thought, you know, and we'll talk more about the best and worst seasons later, but yes, I am in agreement that this was the weakest season of Game of Thrones. Just going back and rewatching our Game of Thrones seasons in 5 minutes, I was like, oh yeah, I did like that season a lot more than this and that and this other one. So yeah.
One of the things that I really appreciated about the earlier seasons was the way the show spent time exploring characters and storylines for the sake of character development and story development, and not just for the sake of plot. And I believe, Roth and Eric, you started Dragons on the Wall in season 5, correct? Which was, to me, I wouldn't call season 6 the turning point for Game of Thrones. I'd actually call season 5, which is the transition season between running out of book material and realizing that the show needed to come up with its own version. And what we saw there was, in the absence of the show having George R. R. Martin's writing to kind of base character and character motivation on, the showrunners had to look into themselves and the characters they've created. And I think that's when the storytelling became a lot thinner, for lack of a better term. It's interesting, we did a poll early on before season 8 began, asking IGN readers, like, what was your favorite season? For me, it's a tie between seasons 3 and 4, but for many people, they actually did vote season 7 and season 6, which were like the biggest in terms of pomp and circumstance and spectacle. So it's interesting seeing the culmination of that, right, in season 8, the biggest pomp and circumstance and spectacle, the most glorious CGI, end up being the most disappointing for so many people, because it also, I think the success and continued popularity of the shows from season 5 on, which I think is when it really became that like global phenomenon. It wasn't necessarily Ned's death or the Red Wedding. It was as the show became bigger and more fantasy. Like, that seemed to reinforce to the creators behind the show, this is what the people want. But that's a long way of saying I'm with all of you that, like, you know, I went along for the ride. There were certain story beats I liked more than others. I was happier with Daenerys's kind of the end of her arc, even if I thought the show did a poor job explaining it. I really was disappointed by the long night and the lack of payoff for the White Walkers. But like, this is the bed Game of Thrones made for itself when David and Dan decided, we're going to rush to the end. And gosh, I look at this season and I say, this could have been 3 excellent seasons of Game of Thrones, and would have been if the show stayed on the same track that it did in those first few. And I think about what could have been and cross my fingers, George R. R. Martin will put out the books eventually and we'll get some version of that. Are there high points for this season for you guys? And we've talked a lot about episode 2. I agree that felt like the most Thrones it had been in a while.
I instantly, my mind goes to Brienne getting knighted, right?
Yeah.
It's like, that is the greatest moment to me of the season, in the best episode of the season, again, that's probably a great example, because yes, she's a knight at the end of the show, but it didn't really need to happen, right? She could still fight in the battle, and she and Jaime could have their bond, but it's a wonderful emotional beat for a character that we've watched on this journey, and for her and Jaime, who've had one of the most fascinating relationships on the show. So that, to me, is my favorite. There's other good moments, for sure, and some of them are big spectacle moments, but yeah, just that, you know, they put out a still of it, and it's like, you know, her getting knighted, and just, that's super emotional, wonderful, a moment that's all about character, and very earned because of the history we have with both these characters. It really stands out.
Any other favorites? I know that's actually, the more you talk about it, that's my favorite too, so there's not a diversity there.
I did like Jaime and Cersei's death scene. Yeah. I thought it was the last time they tried to humanize those characters, or at least Cersei, and kind of wish that Dany had her kind of moment of humanization, even right at the very end, instead of just being the kind of like angry girlfriend thing or whatever the hell was going on there. Like, just give her that one last moment of humanity so that he has a real reason to doubt what he's about to do, but he still has to do it. And they didn't do that. They just wanted to go into like supervillain mode at that point. But yeah, I think Dany and I mean, Cersei and Jaime's death scene, you know.
Kind of on the flip side, and Joshua, I know she is one of your favorite characters, but let's talk about the disservice this season did to Cersei Lannister. She got, I believe it was tabulated, 25 minutes of screen time in the final season of Game of Thrones.
Although, can we cheers Lena Headey?
Yes, we are all cheersing right now.
Also, she She made
drink to
$1
that.
million to drink wine and hang out on a balcony, and I am
Touch
here
your belly.
for it. You know? Like, good for her, because she's an amazing actress. Yeah, she was done a disservice. I think, and this is not going to be popular, they did very well with Brienne, certainly, where they had a lot of liberty and freedom. She had some of the best moments, including writing Jaime's. They did well with Sansa. Where they stumbled was like Varys. Where did that come from? It came from nowhere. That's not that guy, you know. And it's a total betrayal. And I think, I think Daenerys landed exactly where Daenerys was going to land, because, you know, she was the Jim Jones of this world. She was a person that was starting to get high on her own supply and believe that she had this grand destiny. But they did a disservice in how they got her there. And I actually didn't feel much until I read Emilia Clarke talking about the episode this morning. And
It was
then
the New Yorker article, correct?
And then I felt heartbroken.
For her.
Yeah. Do you want to paraphrase a little? Like, basically,
I mean, no, go for it.
I mean, she was just saying that she was really, you know, one of the interesting things I read in some interview with her was where she kept trying to play over the seasons Daenerys as more heroic, and the showrunners and directors would give her notes to kind of pull her back from that. But that for her, when she read this script for the first time, she said she walked for like 5 hours until her feet got blistered, just to try and like wrap her head around it. And in this New Yorker interview that she did, they brought up the fan petition that now has 1.2 million people have signed, wanting Game of Thrones season 8 to be reshot. It will never happen, but a very, very vocal way of the fans expressing their dissatisfaction with this season. And she hadn't heard about that, but she did speak to what she would have changed. And she basically said character moments, right? She's like, I would have loved some scenes between Dany and Cersei. I would have loved some more scenes between Dany and Melisandre. And to me, like, we've talked a lot about this, I'm sure you have as well, where what the show chose to do, again, after that season 5, season 6 moment, really we first saw it with Arya and Sansa's like back and forth that culminated in Littlefinger dying, was it no longer offered us the perspective of these characters, which it did for so many seasons, in lieu of having these surprises that maybe didn't have that motivation on the screen for us to follow for the sake of surprising us. And we absolutely get that first with Cersei in season 7 and definitely in season 8, where I have no idea what she's thinking. No idea what she's thinking. And that's so disappointing to me, because getting inside Cersei's head was so compelling.
Oh, by the way, I'm so sorry, but Cersei frickin' Lannister, I'll blow you up in the sept if you wronged me, would have had a plan. And the plan is so obvious of what it would have been. First of all, you're not walking up to her that unarmed, and she's got a bunch of scorpions, and the only dragon left is in the background, and she doesn't take it out right then. Are you kidding me? Come on. She would have taken Tyrion out, Daenerys out, the dragon out. She would have been like, great, thank you for the buffet. I'm about to eat my lunch. And then if they were dumb enough to get themselves in the situation where they were attacking the city, she absolutely would have waited till all of the armies were in there and then blown it up.
For sure. All that wildfire.
Yeah, it seemed like they literally just realized in post, we should add some wildfire.
Let's add some wildfire.
Because, but also Cersei, I'm like, that's actually probably maybe the thing that makes me maddest about the final season was the service done to her. Just as a character. I mean, great villain, but a fully rounded villain that in the final season just pushed off to the side. Her pregnancy, I was like, what was the point? She's pregnant, then people wondered, is that true? If she is pregnant, she's lying to Euron, saying it's his when it's not. Didn't mean anything.
What was the point of magic? What was the point of the White Walkers? What was the point of Aegon Targaryen?
Oh yeah, that was a big
What
one.
a good segue to our next section, which is literally what is the point of Game of Thrones? And I say that not in the sense of being flippant, but honestly, I think a reason why many of us invested in this, in the books before it, I think everyone except for Jim, it's okay, Jim, you still got time until that next book comes out.
So much time.
But so many years.
I'm 70.
There's a lot in the story that we as viewers kind of used to traditional narrative storytelling invest in because we think there is a point. And to me, it is okay if the point is there is no point. That is a point to be made. But what do you think for some of these things that we clung to, saying there must be a point to some of this? How do you think those paid off? I know I'm speaking very generally. And what are some of the things that you were disappointed in the way they kind of landed for you?
Just politically, what was the point of that ending? What is that like?
That wasn't breaking the wheel.
No, it wasn't breaking the wheel, and it wasn't. the show has kind of flirted with authoritarianism, which I think is kind of an interesting thing given the times we live in, and as the world shifts more and more in that direction across the globe. Like, was it kind of a warning, like a 1930s style warning of, fascism is coming? But it doesn't really go there, because in the end, they kind of want to have it both ways. They want to say that, there's room for nobles and stuff like that, but as long as it's the right noble, which isn't the answer, because that's basically the Dany solution. It's okay if you have, magic and essentially a nuke, as long as it's the right person with it. And I'm like, that's not really a message. It wasn't really about all these people on the ground, even though we're supposed to feel bad for the people in King's Landing because they get toasted. So it's like, politically and morally and intellectually, what was the point? And I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, and the best I can come up with is that Bran isn't a good guy, and that that they somehow didn't figure
Roth
that out.
Is pointing at Jim right now, agreeing with this.
The two things that he basically says that are of note is, why do you think I showed up, and where's the dragon? So what are you supposed to take away from that? I think he did a little finger, let everyone else kill each other off, and he just literally sat back and waited, and that's why he was so chill when the Night King came up. And so, but if that is the message, which is you cannot trust anybody with any bit of power, whether it's a dragon or being a three-eyed raven or whatever the hell it is, is that why he picks Tyrion? Because he knows this is not the most clever man in Westeros.
This idiot's going to go whatever I say. He thinks I have a good story.
But if that's the point, then they really should have gone horror movie route or something with it and hammered it home, because that's the only thing I can take away is stop trying to find a hero, because there aren't any.
Kaiser Soze Westeros, man, right? But I don't think that they meant to do that.
Yeah.
I think they would have leaned into it.
Yeah, they could have had a final shot of Bran. They could have done it.
It's one of the only reads that you can make, because certainly they haven't done enough to really illustrate what his abilities are and are not. And they've certainly done plenty to indicate that he has some sort of ability to Doctor Strange the future and potential outcomes, right? Because he was hanging out like, oh, hey, I absolve you, Theon, because I know you're about to eat it, and I know exactly what's going to happen, and why did I come all of this way? Wink, my arc had a point, audience. And
I promise.
I'm sounding so negative. I apologize.
My big thing, and I fully agree with you, I think the showrunners set this up intending it for her to be like, look, a happy ending, a just ruler. He has every single knowledge of everything in the past to know what you need to be to make a wise ruler. We keep going back to that Tywin and Tommen scene from several seasons ago. But what the show seems to have forgotten, even though it winks at it with the, we'll just go check in on where Drogon is now Westeros and the world lives in ultimately an authoritarian police state.
Yes.
Like he is the little brother, and Dan Stapleton, one of our reviews editors, is writing a piece on IGN about this as well, but he digs into how this is the worst possible outcome for a ruler, to be able to see literally everything that is happening ever. This is Minority Report, everything you were thinking and talking about you could do. It's a dark timeline.
What if somebody's like, no, I really don't want you to raise taxes on us. What's he going to do? Warg into something and have him eaten?
Yeah, the show never deals with the dark morality of him warging into humans. Like when he was doing that in Hodor, the show never addressed that this was really screwed up, which the books do get into, and I have to think that it's not going to be as simple a solution in the books, but there are a lot of concerning factors happening with him being king.
100% there are, and also the point of the series, ostensibly speaking, is to embrace humanity and the areas of gray in our lives, right? And in who we are. And there's a complete betrayal of that, to say that the Night King was a figure of menace and he was pure evil, and that's not the point, because the darkness to come is what's in us, and us wrestling with our own demons, right? But there's a complete betrayal of that when you then just turn and make Dany black and white, and Bran the black and white good leader, only nothing has earned that at all, and he's not even human anymore. He says he's not.
That's where I think the books, that's, again, because we don't know, I was saying this last night, it's like, because we don't know for sure every single thing that they were told by George R. R. Martin, but presuming he told them and Bran ends up on the throne at the end, that's just the thing where you just assume the books are going to do a much better job and a much more in-depth job, whereas the show was kind of pushing Bran to the side. Oh, he's not as exciting to follow, he can't have action scenes, and by his design, we don't really understand his thinking. I feel like the books are going to probably do a much better, nuanced job, and maybe even portray that the dark side of him being on the throne at the end, if that is how the books end. Because the way show did it was just kind of random.
And if there really is that transition to, like, Bran identifies as the three-eyed raven on the show, and if the book perspective chapters after a certain point are just three-eyed raven, at least we get book perspective chapters on what the three-eyed raven is thinking. Like, I don't know, is that what he does at this point? But Laura, I'm curious, are there any, what is the point questions you were kind of left with?
Yes, I think that I struggle, especially with the White Walkers and how that was all paid off. I totally agree with Roth in that, the real danger was inside us. It isn't this kind of existential threat of, whatever. But I think the show has done such a bad job, and I think it's because Benioff and Weiss just don't care about, like, magic and mythology the same way that Martin and some of the book readers obviously do, that they kind of went into spectacle and, dodging and big battle scenes a lot more than actually explaining what Bran's powers are, what warging is, and why it's so meaningful. Where the dragons come from, all of these big mythological questions that they just don't seem interested in answering. But the books and I guess the fan theory world has set up to have us digging into and obsessing over so much.
I do roughly speaking, I apologize for continuing to go back to the books, but that kind of, to me, that still is like the master plan, right, that we're getting the SparkNotes version of in the show, especially the past few seasons. And if the point in the books is that the prophecies we're obsessing over, the magic we're obsessing over, all these different theories about who could end up on the Iron Throne ultimately do mean nothing. And it's about the human condition and humans making choices to embrace the gray and just be better than what came before. I am fine with that, genuinely. Yeah. I think it was the sense of this rushed conclusion for it, and I don't think the White Walker storyline will exist anywhere near what it did in the show as it does in the books, because the Night King as a character doesn't exist in the show. And this idea that it's we keep referring to it as vampire rules, but that you kill the main one and poof, everyone's gone, seems like it's actually working in contradiction to some of the tropes that George R. R. Martin wanted to challenge in terms of creating his story. It disappoints me that in this season, the closest we get to acknowledging that was Davos offhandedly saying, was this the Lord of Light's plan? When he's talking about Melisandre's death, he's like, what was the point of it all? What was the point of her journey and her coming back for that to be it? And everyone just kind of moves on beyond that. But I think that's a great question that I wish we'd explored a little bit more, and I think that will be probably a moment that we come back to as viewers.
Yeah, if you're existing in this world where all of these things exist, you have to acknowledge them.
Yeah.
Warging was such a big deal in the books. It was such an integral part of the Stark family that all of them had these bonds with their direwolves. The show just kills off the direwolves. We see Ghost at the end in 20 seconds and he gets a pet. It's just...
He did get a
He got a good pet. We're all very happy about that.
I always wanted them to explore a little more what the average person thinks about any of these magic things. I wanted to see someone the morning after that battle be like, did you see how she just set all those fires? They shouldn't see that normally, but sometimes they seem to be nonchalant and sometimes they seem to be in awe of it. But I think, again, that speaks to Benioff and Weiss, just that wasn't the thing that they were that into.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So they put it in because they had to put it in, but it just wasn't where the part lies.
You kind of feel like there's going to be payoff, and then there isn't payoff, and then that's frustrating for it.
The magic becomes that kind of proverbial gun that's introduced in Act 1, and you're waiting for it to go off in Act 3. But it's one of the questions you asked was what's the point of magic? And one fan theory I always had that didn't end up making it out, was that in order for people to really exist and move on and survive, they couldn't be trusted with magic because they can't even have weapons without turning on each other. So what are you going to do in a world where there's still a dragon out there and this guy has magic powers and Arya could conceivably still switch faces and like just people have already shown that they're just shits and they can't be trusted with anything. And so the show just leaves all that stuff still out there. So how am I supposed to feel like anything in Westeros is actually going to change either for the better, or if you're going to just leave it with magic, then hint at something darker coming, you know?
I think it is interesting, though. It's like easy to forget if we go back to season 1, we were introduced to a Westeros that lived in the shadow of a world run by magic. Like it wasn't, the implication is it wasn't until Daenerys, killed Mirri Maz-Dur, sacrificed Khal Drogo, walked into the pyre with her dragon eggs and they burst, that magic really was kind of reintroduced to the world, and it kind of grew since then, because even you can track back to like Thoros of Myr used to just fake light his sword on fire, and then suddenly he could. And Melisandre at a certain point couldn't do magic, and then she could, and that brought it all back. And so I do kind of like the idea that it quietly faded away and could tie back to the fact that like magic wasn't necessarily the Chekhov's gun that like, saved the day and everything, because it wasn't magic that destroyed Daenerys. And technically it wasn't magic that destroyed the Night King either. It was humans.
Love.
Well, Arya loved that Valyrian steel.
It was stick training,
Yeah.
really.
Exactly.
Several years. Yeah, I mean, imagine a world in which this finale had either Cersei. Well, no. Imagine a world in which this finale had Daenerys be victorious, and imagine a world in which, over the last 2 seasons, her character hadn't radically been having a nervous breakdown that then completely went away and she looked great. Like, there should be the same wear and tear throughout. Is all I'm saying, physically as well.
Who is doing her hair?
Yes.
And she had her evil outfit.
And then she like went back to change. She was like, well, I've done something evil and I'll change into this outfit now, clearly, to make my speech. But all of that aside, imagine a world in which she still had good intentions, and she did have a plan, and that there was a world in which she could do things to liberate people. But the cost of that was slaughtering people in the streets. Right. And the cost of that was the cost of war, which has always been the cost of war. Mm-hmm. It's never been easy, and it's never been without brutality, and it's never been without bloodshed. Right. And every single side is going to be equally brutal. And imagine in which they just left you with that. Yeah. Instead of now she's satisfying. Evil.
I think to me that's one of the things that I ultimately like about the arc Daenerys went on, even if I didn't like the way they went about it, because I do, we were talking about, and I really like the way you put it, Roth, that it's not just about subverting story tropes for the sake of subverting story tropes. But to me, I like the fact that it is a trope. Like, we see this rise of Daenerys as a queen, as a ruler we want to get behind. And we, as the reader, as the viewer, actively don't challenge some of the things that she's doing that maybe are questionable. And I found an old Dragons on the Wall episode featuring Eric and Joshua, where circa 2006, in season 6, or sorry, 2016, season 6, way back, you were talking about, like, is Daenerys being set up to be a villain? Like, I think the seeds were there. You did it. You're Bran.
We're the only one.
Yeah. But, like, I think this idea that, all of our inklings, like, are we missing the bigger picture? Like, she's a conqueror. She's not ruling any of these cities. Like, certainly in the books, that's the mess she's created in Meereen. Like, I think they're really going to get into that. I think I like that. It's, again, us as the viewers putting blinders on and missing the bigger picture that's being laid out for us, even though they really did botch it in the final seasons. To me, that really harkens back to Robb's poor decision-making that led to the Red Wedding. It was there. It was telegraphed. Like, we were watching these events happen and cheering for him as our hero and not expecting that the true human cost of making these decisions will lead to his death. Same with Ned Stark. I think that ultimately is why I like the way that Daenerys' story went. I just wish they'd spent the time to really stick the landing with it. And I like the way that you're kind of describing it as well. Imagine if it had paid off that way. We got to see her viewpoint and the way she viewed the world and understand that she still thinks she's doing it for good. We just now have the context of King's Landing versus Meereen being the people that she's decided are the bad she needs to destroy.
Well, and she's never killed civilians before. Yeah. She hasn't done that.
No.
And she's never, and I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think we've all had those conversations. Daenerys could have a heel turn. It's the Mad Queen. Here it comes. Oh, she got a dragon. She got 3.
She's a crazy lady.
She's starting really ready to burn stuff. I mean, so I don't think it comes out of nowhere. But is it the most interesting thing to do? Even if those are her traits. Is it just one thing or the other? And she really has never killed citizens before.
Yeah, and that's the thing is like it was that switch flipping. You know, we don't have to go again into the bells, but it was like it's like it happened because it had to happen at that point.
Right.
It's like it's the penultimate episode, better happen. And it was just it was like I was doing my fan writing online about maybe it would have worked better if like that's when Cersei killed Melisandre or like all these things that maybe would have helped. But at the end of the day, it's just like it really needed a full season. It needed several more episodes.
She needed to see that. Really see that the people weren't with her, and kind of give it a context for losing trust and finding love from the people. And because it to me it just screamed about her like deep insecurities and stuff too, and like her sense of entitlement and all that. And so instead of it being just a switch being flicked, like really spend that time seeing her disillusionment with the people that she thinks she's liberating, and maybe even having to quell a rebellion.
Better sell that Cersei has faked them into thinking they should trust her.
Right. Like we don't see anything from Cersei's perspective or Dany's about what they feel about the people. We see them being herded into King's Landing, but that's literally our only context for these people being used as pawns.
Yeah.
And sadly, that's like the only episode in at least 2 seasons that showed us what the people think, that showed us the world from the people's perspective. Like, I liked, even though Sam got scoffed, like, they're all trying to save the people, but what do the people think? And the show has gone the route of celebrity cameos like Ed Sheeran to explore the people's perspective instead of actually showing us some of those moments and having characters interact with people, which I think, again, the books do a lot better job of, even if Westeros is like a smoking husk of a country at certain points.
See that though, it's a little similar to like Dark Knight Rises and Thor Ragnarok, where it suddenly becomes about this community, and you're like, wait, who the hell's even there? It's like, we better show some people running to something, and then it's like,
a mother and a child. Yeah. A mother and a child.
Oh, I mean, the minute you see the horse.
Right.
When you bring up the people, it really... the people to me are the Beatles from, of course, Tyrion gives that story about his cousin who smashes what's the cousin's name?
Cousin Orson.
Cousin Orson, who just for no good reason is just taking a stone and smashing all these beetles, and Tyrion just became obsessed and would like watch him and just, why does he keep killing all these beetles? Like there had better be a point to that. In a way, that's sort of like maybe George R. Martin like painting a picture for the audience of like what is the purpose between killing all these people, and it's ultimately like power, right? And that's a commonly spoken about theme of Game of Thrones, of what power does to certain people, what people will do for it, what people without it will do to get it, how it affects people who don't want it but must take it up anyways. And this is power in terms of authority and of having like prestige over lands and people, but also having a dragon that can breathe fireballs at people. But it's just what does power ultimately mean, and how do people use it? And ultimately, for all the power that Tyrion, who I like to fancy as maybe the main character of Game of Thrones, it led to him in a pile of rubble in his home, essentially. Well, it was his home, the castle, with his brother and his sister dead in front of him, his only family, which was that was a very powerful moment for me, especially because he then picked up a brick and then pounded it on the ground out of frustration. But you could read that as a throwback to Orson smashing beetles, of like, these are just the latest of 2 beetles to be smashed, and this had better mean something. And for all the power and influence and having the ear of multiple people who have the power to chart the course of Westeros, this is what it all came down to. So the story definitely had a sort of the bittersweet thing going there, which is why it felt so weird for them to want to put such a nice, like, pretty bow on at the end and make it seem like a happy ending. And he's like making jokes with the small council, moving around the chairs, and they're making jokes about brothels and stuff. But I was like, whoa! Like, you just had like
who's still left in this city?
All the prostitutes are dead. All the prostitutes burned to death.
Like 3 weeks, that's a big city.
Yeah.
One thing I'll quickly point out, though, Joshua, is that scene actually isn't from the books. That was a show invention scene, which shows us how high the writing could have been. At certain points, there were high moments that came up that were invented just for
Cersei
the
and
show.
Robert's conversation back in season 1 that really gave you an insight into their failed doomed
Absolutely.
marriage.
And
So sad.
The Orson Beetle thing too. There's another way you can look at that, which is, well, why were you fascinated watching this carnage play out and wanting to know? And I felt like that's kind of a question to the audience too. And it reminds me of like the way people will get hung up on The Sopranos, and they only seem to think The Sopranos was good when somebody was going to get killed, when somebody was going to get whacked. And so when they had the whole season with Tony going off on having his dream or whatever, and people got bent out of shape about it, because they were investing in the show and these characters for the wrong reason. And I think that there's a larger picture there about the sort of what people's gravitation towards these authoritarian figures reveals about us. Why did so many people want Dany to end up on the throne when she clearly... The bad seeds were in there all along. Why did so many people want this myth of Jon Snow turning out to be the king? Why do you need one person to rule over all of you? You know,
Why does it have to be so neat?
Yeah, or just like what is it revealing about us that people would name their kids after Daenerys, and then even after all this stuff, they're still like finding excuses. To me, it's just like the pop culture equivalent of like making excuses for criminals and stuff, where it's like, oh no, they're their good side.
I think it's more rebelling against the fact that Game of Thrones is not a show about character archetypes, but it's supposed to be a show about characters and humans. And so I've seen a lot of disappointment. Many people asking, what is the point of Jon Snow if he's not going to end up king? And I'm like, at what point did he do anything that really showed that he would make a good king?
Right. He makes terrible battle decisions. Just awful.
Can't keep a secret.
My theory,
Thank God.
I think the show, I got faked out a little bit in that final sequence, because my theory going in was going to be that the wildlings were going to come to the south. It was going to be full-scale destruction, and that the wheel really was going to break. And because they didn't bend the knee and they kind of elected their leader, that they would merge the way that they constructed government, and it would end up in, I know this is silly, but democracy. I was like, hashtag democracy.
They literally laughed at that.
And then there was a moment as we were watching it last night that Sam said that, and I was like, called it democracy. And no, that is not the way it went.
Kind of, because like the great
It's a
houses
pinch of
are
democracy.
Yeah, it was like it was a step.
College.
Yes, it was a baby step towards that. But I think to your point, Jim, like to me that would have been, even if all of the people that we were rooting for at the end of the day, they either had to die for their ambitions or they reconciled themselves to the fact that their ambitions were getting the better of their better natures, would have been more satisfying than like, well, we don't believe in humanity at all, so the tree's going to rule.
right.
You win, Groot. No, I like the Michael Corleone of it all. Like, you just accept that, I sold my soul for power, and I thought I was a family person, but it turns out, no, I'm the monster they didn't want me to end up becoming.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
We've talked a lot about criticisms for the show as a whole, and certainly in terms of the finale, but I mean, we all love the show, and we can all agree that it certainly did some great stuff over the seasons as well. Let's go down the line and talk about your favorite character arc. The character does not have needed to last until the end. They could have just been at the beginning. They could have just been at the end. But what is a character that you just really loved, kind of the full journey that they went on? Eric, we can start.
I think I'll go. There's a few choices, which again speaks to the show's great qualities, that I could pick a few people, but I think I'll go with Sansa. I just rewatched the whole series before the final season, and it was funny to go back to be like, oh yeah, I hated her, to remember like how annoying she was and how she did all the wrong things early on. And to see her, the harsh lessons she had to learn from the start, when her father's killed. I mean, everything with like her trying to see a good side to Joffrey that's not there, to seeing what horrible person he is, and now she's trapped with him. her escape, where the amazing, even though we joked about the costume change, her coming down the stairs, Dark Sansa. Then, of course, you had to go through so much horror with Ramsay, which on one hand felt like pulling the rug under us because it left that season, it left like, now's her time, and then it wasn't her time. In fact, it was her worst. She had to go through so much, but we saw her really grow and strengthen, and I don't know, I just really loved by the end to see the transformation of who she was, and that she was, because Ned Stark is a beloved character, but of course he was horribly naive, and so is she in a different way, because she was believing in princess and fairy tales and sort of thing. So I just thought to see her at the end that her resolve, the fact that she can sort of make her own decisions and really take charge, and very much you can believe that she will be a strong and good leader. I think that was a pretty amazing arc from the person she was in the pilot who we got at the end.
I was thinking about this because I was reading some interview, I believe that she did, where she was talking about how, in the books, it's not Sansa who has this experience. It's a character named Jane Poole, who is married to Ramsay and presumably beaten is around Theon. He saves her. And I'm very curious to see where Sansa ends up in the books versus the show, knowing that, they have that line that's like, well, I wouldn't be who I am today without going through all these horrible experiences.
It's a trash line, and they shouldn't.
It's a bad line.
Problematic line. But I think, if she's, I'm just very curious to see if she ends up in the same place, because I agree. She ended up being one of my favorite characters, and I realized how much I didn't give her credit for being smarter than she was in those earlier seasons when I went back and
I loved Arya actually saying how smart she. That was a good moment of this season, was Arya complimenting her.
Well, she went from like a Disney princess to Elizabeth I. Right at the end.
Oh.
Ginger.
How about you, Roth? Did you have a favorite?
Married to England.
And she was.
She was.
She's married to the North. She don't need no man.
I love what they did with Sansa as well, and I think they were at liberty to do that, to your point, because they did divorce themselves from wherever she's going to end up in the books. But Jaime, and I know a lot of people were not happy with where Jaime ended up, but how I believe that it was perfect, because Jaime and our love of Jaime is very confronting. Jaime's never been a good guy. He's never purported himself to be a good guy. Right. He has killed his cousin for no good, to escape. He's pushed a child. The first thing we saw him do is bang his sister and push a little kid out a window. But he
our
is
hero.
Our hero, Jaime, right? So however, he's had so much color and richness and depth to his character over the seasons through his actions, through his relationships, through his choices. He goes back and he gets Bran, he in every moment, but in that same sequence, he's damning the Starks that we love. Right? That's who Jaime is.
And he said he'd do it all
and
over
he
again
would said,
too.
And he said he would, and because he would do it all over again too. And that's who Jaime is. He embodies for me the best of this series, which I do love, by the way. I feel like that's not been clear. I still love Game of Thrones. I really love it, but it's like,
you see where it could have been, how it could have been better.
We're tender right now. We're going to watch it again. But for me, Jaime encapsulates everything that's brilliant about this show, which is he is all of those things at once. He confronts us about who we are and what we love and what we deem a hero or not. And at the very end, he comes back to himself and behaves exactly as he would. He told you he loves Cersei. He told you nothing else mattered. He told you he wanted to die in her arms. He told you he would burn the world for her. He absolutely stuck to his word.
And what a testament to Nikolai Coster-Waldau as well. I think one of the most underappreciated actors on this show, who's been lucky enough to share screen time with some of the most talented, like Lena Headey, Charles Dance, Peter Dinklage, Gwendolyn Christie, their dynamic together. I've loved his performance, and I think he's brought so much humanity to a character who is very two-dimensional when you meet him.
Oh, absolutely. And also, the other way that he stuck to himself and his guns is that when it comes to the full-scale slaughter of civilians, he has always made the right choice. He killed his king, and he turned his back on Cersei, and he came back to rescue her, not to back her in that endeavor. Right. So he did not betray his own arc, in my opinion.
Agreed. You just picked the two that I would pick. I love both of them. It's like, oh shoot. Everything that you both said is very true. Yes, I agree with both. If I'm not picking those two,
Joshua is crossing his fingers.
Well, I'll say people probably don't give enough credit to Davos, who I've always loved and has always been a character who has stayed consistent throughout the show, morally, has been willing to compromise when necessary, but has always been a good guy, a guy willing to tell the truth, a guy who looks out for the little people and kind of keeps his eye on the macro rather than, the political BS that's going on. So I was really thrilled to see him survive. I always thought that he would
Master of Ships!
Master of Ships.
What a promotion!
Bantering away with Bronn. I love it so much. And I don't know if you're going to pick Brienne, but she would be my other one. Would you?
No, please, go ahead.
Yeah. Again, for the same reasons that she was, there wasn't a big change in her character, but just to see her grow and to see how Gwendolyn, fully fleshed her out and gave her so much depth and humanity and honor. It was just so lovely to see those characters.
I love that Gwendolyn Christie has specifically cited one of the producers and writers, Brian Cogman, for being a huge champion of Brienne from the beginning. He wrote the bath scene, if you remember. Amazing sequence. Did he do the Bear and the Maiden Fair? I don't think that was him, actually. But he wrote the knighting scene at the end, and I'm so glad that she was one of my favorite arcs as well.
I love her too, so I'm glad you brought her up.
Yes.
Although I will give an honorable mention just to Tyrion Lannister, who, as I said before, is in a lot of ways the main character of Game of Thrones, who has such a brilliant arc. Although he's not my number one pick. My number one pick would actually be Arya Stark, because she just had such a wonderfully sculpted journey. And she's a character who decided from the get-go, she was like the tomboy. She did not want to be a lady. She did not want to be what, the medieval socio-political environment wanted her to be, had already designed of what her life would be. And so to see her go and, first, she has so many great scenes throughout the whole series, with Syrio and everything, and then she decides.
Charles dance later too.
Which invented for the show.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent.
Yes,
so good.
For as much as we're dunking on the show and all the mistakes they've made,
Tywin than Roose.
they added some really great stuff, and that was an excellent addition of just those excellent conversations. It's me lord, not my lord, stuff like that. But ultimately, she decided she didn't want to be that. So then she had to become no one, right? And then she went and she got that crazy, weird assassin training and stuff, and was literally told she was no one, and was broken down into nothing. Then we saw her decide that, no, that's not for me, but I do want to be somebody, but not quite that. And so we then saw her rediscover who she was, and she built Arya Stark to be the compassionate yet awesome, badass woman that she became, and it was just so awesome seeing that. That's also kind of when they started pushing fast forward and kind of jumping ahead, but still she always got awesome moments. Her journeys with the Hound and everything, especially some of my favorite moments. One of my favorite moments of the show is just her getting on that ship, and just the symbolic visual meaning of her getting on that ship and going off to someplace new was so powerful. And then in the end, to see all that amounted to her taking out the Night King by stabbing him in the tummy, that was so cool. But she earned it so well. Because a lot of people, I hate this term, but people love to throw out, Mary Sue, Mary Sue. It's you could never call her that. You can never call her that. Because
she has earned it more than anyone.
She got hit in the face with a stick so many times to learn how to be a fighter and how to be an assassin and do all that stuff. And it's just, everything about her arc just feels so gratifying, so earned, such wonderful moments portrayed by Maisie Williams. The acting was just spot on. And she was the character of any other who I was most nervous about going into the finale, because I thought, I just don't want anything bad to happen to her, because she's so well rendered, and she's one of the few characters who was able to have some agency throughout the entire show, and didn't really feel like they mishandled her too much, and she was a great product of the TV show.
One thing that I do wish the show had done with her that they didn't was, if they were going to challenge Daenerys as being a tyrant, as being a villain, the show never really holds up a mirror to Arya Stark for being a serial killer, basically.
Right.
Like, she's murdered so many people, and it's ultimately for good. And I hope that there's a little bit more of a challenge in the books there, because I love Arya. I want to cheer for her, but nothing is ever so simple in Game of Thrones, right?
You're right. There was like a beat missing that probably got lost when they truncated the show down to what it became.
John and Sansa going, wait, how many people did you do? What did you do?
Like, where are these real faces?
Why do you have a bag of faces?
You're trying to put your clothes away for you so you feel really come in Winterfell, and we have found some concerning paraphernalia. But I love Arya. She's the best. I'm sticking with the pointy end. Jim.
Well, I agree. Jamie was actually my pick, and he's still my number one pick for pretty much all the reasons Roth said. I also, though, love that he was probably the most honest of all the characters. Like, he already kind of knew himself, and then he still found out even more over another few seasons. Then I guess the backup to that one would be a similar sort of arc, and that's the Hound. And that he wasn't in the show much when you really think about it, but his arc and his sort of from going from, just a mean bastard, but maybe there's a heart of gold in there, to him being, well, maybe he's dead now. That was the last we saw of him. And then, he goes off to what is it, Brother Ray, Ian McShane's character, and like
Brother Ray
finds the Lord of Light or whatever. But like that, his cynicism that was always kind of masking that heart of gold. I love that kind of archetype. And then even in the end, though, him being true to himself, being like, no, this is my mission in life, is to get this guy that did this to me. And that's why I think, to speak to the Arya Stark, the Stark arc a little bit. Ooh, that's a tongue tire. She needed that little extra moment besides just the, oh, wait, you mean I could get killed doing this? Like, to really accept that she doesn't want to end up like this guy. But I loved, like, even watching these recaps again, like, and you see how Maisie grows up in the show, to him like riding along with her and being that kind of protective figure, even if he just is not sentimental in the least. And he's not, the whole Lord of Light stuff to him, like even when he sees in the flames and everything, but he's still like, screw that guy or whatever. So I think those are those characters that are honest with themselves, I think, were the most interesting ones. And I think that's maybe where the Daenerys and the Jon Snow stuff kind of fell apart, was we didn't get to see them kind of have those moments.
And I think none of us picked Cersei because they failed her in the final season.
Yeah, I was going to say, if it had been anything other than this season, if it had ended last season or 2 seasons ago, Cersei would have absolutely been one of my favorites.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. The first 20 minutes of the season 6 finale, where the build up to her, the first 20 minutes are the best episode of Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah.
You were at the season 7 premiere, right, where they showed that before? And just to watch it again, we're just like,
the build up to that,
good.
the most masterfully directed and executed sequence the show has. I get chills thinking about it. The music, everything, like so perfect, culminating.
Even if it took out my Marjorie, who I loved.
Yeah, 100%.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So I am cheating a little bit, which I warned you all before that I would do, but you all took mine. I was going to go with Brienne, and then the Hound, of course. So many, Jamie, I love. So many good ones. So I'm going to do 2 small ones. Number 1, he died a while ago, but Tywin Lannister, like one of the best characters on this show, and Charles Dance played it to a T. Like, he chewed scenes with everyone he was in. Remember when he and Diana Rigg, Olenna
You mentioned that to me on Facebook, and I was like,
Yeah, I was like, remember when the show had time for that? She would be in half an episode now.
Yeah.
I loved the way his arc played out, and also the fact that even though he died, his presence and impact on his children stayed present throughout the rest of the series, down to like in Jamie and Tyrion's final conversation with each other, which I love. Like, it goes back to all that, to Tyrion talking about killing his father in that final episode.
The evil Ned Stark is the flip side.
But
of
like
that,
he is a cold, evil man, but he has motivations.
Yeah.
He is
understood
and one of the
exactly
better
what he was
leaders
doing.
on the show.
It's on time.
So-
I mean, it's reliable.
I just love that character. Also, maybe controversial. I'm curious what you guys think of this pick, but Melisandre, I thought ended up having one of the more interesting arcs and payoffs in the small flourishes of character that they did with her up until the end when she just walks off into the dust. She starts off being, again, a very one-note character, single-minded in her purpose and committed, so self-assured. She is the opposite of Daenerys, right, at that moment where she's like, I know what to do, and this is right and good. This is when we should have seen those red flags of, like, what a character who is so certain they are good, but we are so certain they are evil can do. And building up through her being wrong with Stannis, the most horrible thing, one of the most horrible things the show has ever done in the killing of Shireen Baratheon. And then Melisandre seeing she was wrong and Stannis failed, and like having her full sense of purpose fall apart. That amazing, it was the Red Woman was the season 6 premiere, I believe, when she takes off the stone and you realize she is not this hot, sexy lady that is Carice Van Houten, the actress, but like someone who has been so filled with purpose for all this time to have that ripped away. And then I'm disappointed she had such kind of an end, a small end to her arc. But I do like the way, she came back for a reason. She felt she had one purpose left to do. Whether or not she accomplished it, we'll never find out. As Davos pointed out, what was the point of it all? But she just walks off and dissolves. I thought, of some of the small characters, that was one of the more interesting ones for me. And they did way more with her and had more shades of complexity with her than they needed to.
I think you made a really good case.
Yeah.
And I think she is representing
Melisandre.
that side of kind of what we were talking about, like the dogma, the damning of the dogma, the damning of the belief that you unilaterally can say anything. And the most important line Jon Snow ever said was, I don't know. Mm-hmm. When Daenerys challenged him, you know what's right. And he said, I don't. Yeah. Because none of us really do.
Yeah.
Yeah, Daenerys needed that Melisandre kind of moment. She needed a Shireen, basically, to be like, oh,
She needed to be
well, I guess I
That's
should
what King's
keep
Landing
going.
should have been.
It should have been humbling.
I mean, she literally burned all the children that time. But also, another thing about Tywin, just to go back to your first pick, cheater,
This is a Game of Thrones show.
was that, Tywin was wise. He had wisdom. Didn't mean you were going to be a good, a benevolent ruler.
Mm-hmm. His hubris, his lack of perspective and kind of seeing the world around him.
Not having a bathroom door either.
Not having a door, not bringing a shield with him when, he's at his most vulnerable.
He pulled out a shield.
You always bring a shield for the sugar.
Exactly. Please, people at home, I assume, you all have to protect yourselves. But even just going back to his complete contradiction, like, the fact that he was, basically a liar to even himself that he would sleep with a prostitute, but he was like so...
He was like
So
willfully
judgmental,
ignorant of his children, like it was right under his nose and he knew. But
It wasn't a lot of debt, you guys. Let's not...
but the
basically Enron.
The flip side of this, and I'm gonna, again, I'm the one running this ship, so I'm gonna go first this time so no one can steal mine. But let's talk about the worst character arcs. The arcs that we found most disappointing by the end of their run. I will start because this is someone I've gone on record as saying one of my favorite characters, and woof, what a disappointment the way the show planned it out. Bran Stark. Bran Stark, a character who they decided was so unimportant to having be present in the story that they could take him out for a full season so he could Luke Skywalker off screen, who, after he became the Three-Eyed Raven, they just decided they needed to stop giving a personality or give us any sense of perspective or understanding of his purpose, and who ended up becoming king. And again, we talked earlier in this episode about like all these questions that like are tied to his powers, the fact the show never really qualified his powers and what they could do. I thought was really disappointing for a character who I think was kind of set up to be this unexpected hero. And I know I've talked about Mira more than anyone has talked about Mira Reed in the history of ever, but to me, that wraps up in Bran's storyline as being so disappointing that her final scene in the show is saying to Bran, I dragged you in that frickin' sled for seasons. I lost my family. We lost Hodor. We did all this. And for what? And for what? And that is how her storyline ends, because they never felt the need to bring her back or couldn't bring her back or whatever ended up happening. I mean, the purpose is that Bran becomes king, but will he be a good king? I don't know. I kind of have the same questions at the end of his arc that George R. R. Martin had about Aragorn as a king. Will he be a good ruler? Will he be just? What will his tax policies be? Like, those are the things that George R. R. Martin specifically brought up in a 2014 Rolling Stone interview about what inspired him to get into the story of A Song of Ice and Fire to begin with. And I don't think that the show broke the wheel in that sense, and I was let down. R.I.P. the Bran I loved.
I'm probably going to regret this choice, but
good start.
Jon Snow.
I agree.
Because I think that, he had a very interesting arc early on in the first couple of seasons where you're like, he was the son that the mother wouldn't love, and he was ostracized, basically, had to go self-banishment, I guess. He chose, right, to go up to the wall, kind of drawing a blank here a little bit. But like that he had all this kind of setup, and then at some point in time, he just hit a standstill and never quite grew as a character, and just sort of it was almost like they had to make sure that he stayed stupid. Otherwise, all these little plot things wouldn't work.
He was stupid in the show,
but
too.
If he was like a smart cat, and that he was, let's say he was as clever as Tyrion, and he still had a he still had to walk away from it all in the end. Like, they're kind of setting it up at the end that he's Moses, right? He could lead them to the promised land, but he couldn't enter. But it's like, even Moses wasn't that dumb. Moses got lost in the desert for 40 years, but he still got to where he needed to go.
I mean, I think if given the desert for 40 years, Jon Snow...
He's 40 years.
But that's more seasons than they had time for. But, I just felt like he ultimately, all the theories and all the spinning in our heads we had about this character, and it was like, did he really matter? All he was there to do was to drag another biblical figure into this. He was kind of like a John the Baptist too, of like, somebody better's coming than I can, and I just want you all to know about this. And like, then he didn't really, once the Night King was done, we didn't need him, because he suddenly turned into like an appeaser.
But we needed him to kill Dany. That was it. That was the only reason he survived that long.
They just didn't stick the landing with either really leaning into the fact he makes some terrible choices that literally led to him dying. Not that I don't think he should have saved the wildlings, but he didn't read the room very well for that either. And I think with many other characters, they just didn't lean far enough into this idea. Like, if you're really playing him up to be as dumb as he's being with all these decisions and having blinders on with Daenerys, then I wish there were more like side-eye glances between Sansa
everyone
and
calling
Arya.
Tyrion dumb all season. No one says anything about Jon being a silly person.
A Queenslayer.
Okay, so I know a lot of people would probably pick this character as the most disappointing, but I'm third, and no one has said it yet, so I get to say it. So I'm going to say Daenerys Targaryen, and everyone can feel free to chime in on this one. We actually have kind of already beat this dragon to death, but she is a character who I know a lot of people are going to pick on season 8 and even just the past couple seasons of where her arc started getting a little messy, or just felt like completely undeserved. But even almost from the beginning, I always felt something was off about the TV depiction of Daenerys. Having read the books, I just had a very different take on how she just was, her entire personality. But clearly they went this way with the show. Turns a lot of other people like it. They named their kids after Daenerys or Khaleesi or whatever. But I just felt like there was always something missing from the performance, in that often when she was trying to get what she felt she deserved, she was depicted as very petulant and almost like a brat. And that never read right to me, is because she is a young girl, a teenager with a lot of power, a lot of responsibility. But I never quite saw her that way. Like when she went to she was going around kind of shopping for people to invest in her little conquest of Westeros, before she really had much. And she was like, "I will take what is mine with fire and blood." And they're like, no, that's fine. Like, that's not a reason for me to give you any money and all my
Doesn't sound
resources,
great.
and I'm not going to see a return on that for years if it ever comes back. And they were in the right and she was in the wrong, but I felt like they should have played that differently. But that's a very stark, very scene that always like popped out to me. And also like, like the where are my dragons? Like the way that was like memed. I feel like that should have been like a really sad moment, but it was just very like silly.
Right.
But ultimately, yeah, I love a really good like turn to the dark side. Your Darth Vaders, your Anakin Skywalkers,
Walter White.
Yes, your Walter Whites, your even in the Ninja Turtle comic books. Bear with me. There was this arc where Leonardo was recruited by Shredder because he's like, I see a leader in you. You could be so much. I could put your talents to use here. Because a lot of people make fun of him for being the leader of the Ninja Turtles, as if like Bagel Leader is his personality. But then he becomes a foot soldier of Shredder's, and it's this great turn to the dark side. Eventually, he comes back. But I just love
when it's done
when it's done well. And the Bells was sort of her like Darth Vader moment where she fell to the dark side. But yeah, it was so uncompelling, and they didn't do the work to get there, as has been argued by everyone on this panel already and on the internet, and probably will debated until we're cold in our graves. But
just burning, all burning.
We're all burning. Yes.
I wonder though, because like Emilia Clarke, from what we know, got all the season 8 scripts at once, found out before season 8 the arc her character was going on. I wonder if they had given her this turn earlier, if they had said in season 4 or 5 in Marine, here is where Daenerys is going, whether that could have helped chart it better instead of trying to direct her more in that moment. Because if you think about Breaking Bad, you have to imagine that when Bryan Cranston got the pitch from Vince Gilligan, here is what Breaking Bad is. It is about a seemingly good teacher faced with a horrible death sentence of cancer and what he needs to do to survive, and the slow stripping away of his moral structure until he is bad, he is a villain. Like, you have to imagine he knew where that was going from the beginning.
Well,
even
yeah,
if
the
we
whole
as
pitch, right?
even if we as the viewer didn't quite grasp that he wasn't our hero until
you guys, he made meth in the first episode.
He was dabbling in meth.
The first episode.
You haven't made meth?
You remember what we used to do on Keeping It Real? Come on.
It is called Breaking Bad.
And he did that because his hubris wouldn't allow him to take money from the person he started a business with.
But if Emilia Clarke from the start had been building toward it in the same way, instead of thinking she was playing a hero, because you're talking about the comedic "Where are my dragons" moment, but I think back to what was my favorite Daenerys moment, one of my favorite show moments, the first Dracarys, where she burned the Masters and dropped the whip and saved the Unsullied, and I was like, get it, girl, heck yeah. And then you're like, oh, well, maybe not, sure, for a good purpose, because these men are bad, but also she took what was hers with fire and blood and a lot of murder, and I cheered for her. And I wonder if Emilia in that moment knew and really invested in knowing what she was building towards and knowing how people would cheer for her, but what was actually the driving purpose, if that might have, I don't think that would have resolved the entire writing issue.
But there's emotional context to it. That's the thing. We were missing the emotional context of that turn, and it seemed like she had also been missing that from the beginning, because obviously George told them before the show started that this was where they were heading, so there was no excuse not to clue her in on it and let her kind of build to that organically in her own way.
Except for spoilers.
I think part of the problem though too is both Breaking Bad, The Godfather, even Anakin Skywalker, the Star Wars prequels, everyone was told, the public, everyone, these are tragedies right from the get-go. So you know what's coming in a way. And whereas this, there was an element of mystery, and it became about who's going to win the contest, who wants to be a millionaire, basically. And it was, and I think at that point, then you get into that mystery box problem. Not to drag the other guy into this, but of where you have to start keeping people in the dark, even your fellow creatives, because you don't want something to leak. And it's I
think you have to be able to trust your lead female character performer to be able to keep her trajectory secret.
I mean, didn't Solo, a Star Wars story, kind of hint at where we were going to end up?
She's done it all. we
That
will
can be an
literally be
article.
talking about Daenerys' arc for
Yeah, we
years.
can't talk about it.
Laura, who is your pick?
Another person that we've done to death, Cersei. Like that is just the most disappointing trajectory to me, just because we had so much emotional context for why she was making the decisions she made, why she was so backed in a corner, why she was so bitter, why she was so sidelined by all of the men in her life, and kind of forced her to come to this point that we saw her at in kind of the season 6 finale. They just so fumbled the ball with her in these final 2 seasons, and it was just such a disservice to Lena, who is such an amazing, consummate professional and performer, and would always make the most of what very little she was given and could convey so much.
And still did.
Exactly.
25
That's
minutes.
what I mean.
Yeah.
She was like, you still felt for her, but because we had no insight or context into what she was feeling, why she decided that this was a hill she needed to die on, it was just such a waste. I was just so heartbroken by that. Because we've talked about it so much, I will also say Varys really disappointed me this season. For someone who was always, again, so set in his purpose, a character that, like the Hound, we didn't know if we could trust in the beginning, but actually was always pretty straight down the middle about what his goals were and what he wanted to be. To have him sent out like that was heartbreaking to me.
You've got to believe there are extra wrinkles in the book storyline for him, given that there is an entire separate contender for the throne that the show did not include.
Yeah.
I'll tack on, yes, I was super disappointed that Varys, he was so important. He was the one playing the Game of Thrones. Across the board from him was Littlefinger, who also I thought got done dirty.
Yes.
He would be my honorable mention for most disappointed. But both of those characters, I think, once they decided that like the main character, I think at one point they decided who the main characters of the show were going to be to lead us to the end, and they just weren't on the list. But they had to fulfill their roles, but just weren't given like the spotlight.
Like, we're standing back there.
Yeah.
But going back to early show-only scenes, those scenes between Littlefinger and Varys in the throne room, some of my favorites.
Where did it all go wrong when they were playing this grand game and then became so incidental towards the end? So heartbreaking.
Yeah, chaos is. Do you remember chaos?
Chaos is a ladder.
So good.
That is so good. That's such a juicy conversation.
And it got a callback with Bran deadpanning. Chaos is a ladder.
Sold it perfectly.
Yeah. It's hard because I'm with all of you, and particularly with Daenerys, because I think that's a fascinating story. And I think it is the Game of Thrones encapsulated. I know we don't want to talk about her anymore, but I can't help it because the only other one I got is Euron, who just sucks.
Like, what was even the point? You didn't have a whole...
What is the point of you, pirate man?
The biggest arc was his wardrobe change.
It really was the hair.
Sexy
He came back with a whole new look.
Yeah, sexy H&M or Hot Topic pirate.
Like absolutely, what was the point of him? That is to me the through line of the show is ambition and insecurity and hubris overtakes you. And it's so much more satisfying if that's done in a way where the heartbreak of that is truly felt. And I think it's fine and poetic to flip the idea of the hero on its head and say this is slaying the dragon, and there's a tragedy to it. But it's also interesting to say that is what happened, and this person was successful. And that, frankly, people who are driven in that way and are overtaken by their darkest impulses are frequently successful.
Yeah. It would have been much more realistic if she just won and burned everything down.
They've all been said. Laura actually said the two I was thinking of most specifically. But no, so I will say a little bit more about Cersei, just because that's the one that just really kills me. Because like we've said, Daenerys also disappointed in what happened in the final season, even though there it was more about execution versus what happened with Cersei. Though it just felt like they gave up on all the nuance to her, all the interesting stuff about her. I didn't need her redemption or anything like that. I loved her as a villain, but I love that she was we knew a lot about her as a villain. And I think about Emilia Clarke said in that interview, you mentioned that she wished she had scenes with her. I'm like, yes. Yeah. I mean, they spoke at the parlay, but that was it, right? I know technically.
They did each other.
Yeah, they technically were in the part where Melisandre was killed, and yes, when she burnt down King's Landing, they look at each other. But the fact that we never truly got a scene of those two
just
women.
those two.
Yeah,
They never even
talking.
filmed together this season.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, like the parlay is the only time I'm sure that they were in the same place, same same time. But just Cersei, so that specifically really bugs me, but just Cersei as a whole, just it felt like, yeah, we lost the plot with her. We lost what was really motivating her still. Especially when you think about, it's like obviously she peaked in a hell of a way, which is the season 6 finale. It's one of the best parts of the show ever, and it's her fully triumphing, even in a way that is like, I wasn't like she's lost everything.
Nothing to lose.
Yeah.
Right, and I wasn't like I was rooting for her, but damn, I was impressed.
Yep.
But yeah, just that final season, it's so strange how off screen she was, and even when she was there, everyone joked about she's just staring out the window with a drink. It just felt like she was now just an obstacle to be knocked down, and
a pawn.
Yeah. It was very, and of course, yes, she's in over her head, and they kept hitting home over and over again. She had no chance against Dany, and that's fine if she really doesn't. But like, I can't remember who said it. It was like she should still have a plan. She should have a like, not a how I win plan, but a like to hell with you all plan.
Yeah.
She should have been the one to take down King's Landing.
Yes, that is what she would have done.
That's what I thought she was going to do, but it didn't play into the characterization of Dany that they wanted to get
It was
done.
too complicated with both of them.
I thought she would have burned the city to spite Daenerys in a heartbeat.
But that is the Cersei they set up, and that is not the Daenerys
both raced to try to burn it first.
She's
like on wildfire.
Or Daenerys loses it, and she there was no reason. First of all, Drogon was able to shoot missiles out of his mouth, but there was no reason to burn the whole city. She just could have gone straight for the Red Keep, and in so doing, inadvertently set off the wildfire.
Right. Yeah. And then everyone would have think she was a monster.
It was so frustrating that there were so many moments where they could have had an acknowledgement of it. Even when she's talking about, they were bad, like Jon saying, but there were children, and she could have justified herself. Like the way that I took it was her saying, they chose Cersei, and so they were my enemy. And so that is an extension of her previous logic, where she was like, these people chose this thing, and thus they are my enemy. She could have said, there could have been any small amount of justification or recognition of this.
I mean, just the fact that they could have had it where Cersei was like, if I can't have this, nobody can, or she blows up the city. We do see them establish, well, people did survive, so what are we going to do with them? The choice then Dany could have had that could have turned Jon around is like, do we execute all these soldiers and these kids and these families and like come to, which parent do you want to go off with? Do you want to go with them or them? And this is the devil we know. And then she could just be like, well, screw all of you then.
Right.
And then
I love that we once again came back to Daenerys.
I'm so sorry.
But picking back up on Cersei, I did want to add one more thing. It was actually a reason she didn't get as much screen time, and it felt like season 8 could have cared less about her character. It really was a practical reason, because all of the principal characters were up
elsewhere,
north, and even Jaime left, and so who'd you have to talk to? The Mountain, he's not saying much. Euron just wants to bone, and like Qyburn, who's just there for like exposition of like, you're screwed. Oh, now you're really screwed.
But I think that's like the shortcoming of there didn't need to be no one there that she could talk to. They could
Euron could have been more interesting.
Euron could have been more interesting.
She shouldn't have killed her entire supporting cast with wildfire.
Or she just goes down and chats to Alaria.
That's what I was going to say. She's still down there.
Or talk to Melisandre or something.
Or how did they know Melisandre was even important to fish her out of the water? That's not even. Whatever.
There's a lot of.
I get a vibe that
I'm not trying to make excuses.
She's pretty. She must be important.
She must be, but she could have. We never really saw her, rightfully so. This was. We're all agreeing this is one of the best, if not the best, sequences on this otherwise incredible series. Right? We never saw her plotting to blow up the Sept, but certainly we could see her maneuvering. She's learned from her father. She has said it all along. I was listening. I was learning the lessons. And for them to demonstrate how well she had learned Tywin's lessons and how adept Daenerys had everything going for her at the start of that season, and she politically took her out. She basically removed so many of her weapons just through smarts, just through savvy and maneuvering. And we could have seen her actually doing some of that this season and still fail.
Yeah. And I will say, to the point of the the Wildfire Septa Baylor sequence, there actually was clever
Foreshadowing.
Carefully laid build-up and breadcrumbs. Like there's that offhand moment where Qyburn is like, hey, that thing you asked about? Yeah, it's happening. And like you're like, oh, what does it mean? Bran has his vision, and in the vision you can actually see briefly the wildfire, and you're like, wait, this isn't from the Mad King flashback. This is something different. Like the show carefully laid and plotted and set the groundwork, and I mean, I think they thought that all the foreshadowing that they'd done before, like, whatever, was enough for the biggest heel turn on the show.
Or you could lay in the dramatic tension of, we see Cersei plotting and planning, we know she's got all of this stuff going for her, and we think maybe she stands a real chance. Instead of having them literally say, you can't beat Daenerys, and then it's like, oh, I guess
literally
you can't beat Daenerys. Yeah.
Or Cersei thinking that Daenerys, she won't do it. She won't toast them.
Right.
She
could have actually used them as a human shield.
Yeah.
Didn't.
And been like, she won't
that.
do this. Jon Snow is a milquetoast. There's no way he would back somebody that bad and like have her own hubris.
I like
get
that
better.
a lot, right? Like as we're fan writing, it's like I would love if.
Well, we do
stay in
have
this
your
room and
1.6
rewrite
million
seasoning.
signatures now, so
We'll
But
do
yeah,
it,
if
guys.
Cersei had, because again, she's literally quiet when Dany and her have that face-off, but if she, at that moment, she was proactively doing something horrible, like using the citizens as like a human shield that Dany just
And
tore through.
Dany acknowledged she wants me to do this. She did say that.
They set it up. And then
Going
didn't
back, I
make
do
it.
think Melisandre was at the Dragon Pit scene.
Yeah,
so
she was.
They would have known her there. But I will say, in the moment, and then
A random pirate wouldn't. Like,
Yeah. Or like,
How did he find her? And all those like people like
Sometimes
they
you
were
luck
all
out.
being blown up.
Euron was there too. But a
Euron
random guy,
was there, but it's very convenient that Euron was like, oh, look who's in the water.
I feel like Euron would have taken her because she was pretty.
I totally
And
thought,
then
though,
find out.
it's funny that the show set up so much more in that moment where the bells are tolling and Cersei's there and she didn't want to ring the bells. They rang the bells despite her, and Daenerys is sitting there. I thought Cersei was going to spite the city and set off the wildfire and say,
Would have made
"Screw
total
it."
sense.
And then it was Daenerys instead, and you're like, wait, what? Which we have gone over much, and if you need more, I think you can rewind the episode. Start over.
But if you look at it from this angle,
We do have one more section, and I know, I mean, again, we will
through.
be talking about this show for years and years and years to come. But to kind of cap off our look back at the series, I'm going to ask you all, what was your favorite season and least favorite season of the show, and why? And I know this will end up being another long section. We can definitely double up and agree with other people. But Eric, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I'll get out of the way because I'm assuming we might all say season 8 is the least favorite.
I have a different one.
Oh, interesting. Okay, interesting. So I won't.
Everyone else is season 8, though?
I won't take too much time because I think we just gave a lot of reasons why season 8 is our least favorite. Just didn't feel like the show. When I asked about my favorite, I kind of went back and forth on two picks, and the one that the runner-up was season 1. And you mentioned something about how like the show as it went on, the spectacle of it got bigger and bigger. And look, I don't want to be a hypocrite here because I freaking love Battle of the Bastards and some of the big battle sequences. It is funny to go back to season 1 and see when they literally have Tyrion knocked out. There's like seems like there's 20 extras. There's like their army, season 1 is excellent, but my favorite season is I think 3. And yes, it has the Red Wedding, so it's got that going for it. But I didn't want that to be the only reason when I thought about it. I was like, okay, it can't be just the Red Wedding, even though that is amazing TV, this amazing moment that most of us sitting here were waiting for, and yet still not only did it pull off and oh my God, even for those of us who knew it was coming, but just how it did it was artfully done and horrifying in all the right ways. But just when I look at the totality of that season, that's Arya and the Hound traveling together. That's Brienne and Jaime and they're bonding together. It's kind of all the great characters are still at King's Landing because Tywin has arrived, Olenna's arrived, Marjorie. We still have Varys and Littlefinger and Tyrion at his best there. So it's kind of Game of Thrones, I think, and that's when we think back on our favorite parts of Game of Thrones. A lot of it is the scheming, the conversations. I believe Chaos as a Ladder comes from season 3. I hope I'm not wrong about any of these little things.
It's okay, the internet will let you know.
They will let me know one way or the other. I just think that is a firing on all cylinders season. Because it's delivering, you can't beat the Red Wedding for shock, oh my God, water cooler moments, but it wasn't only about that. It's like, first of all, it was very well, like we've said, they built up to it in an incredible way as far as all of Robb Stark's mistakes, but everything going on around the world, the show was, I think, just at its utmost of confidence, and they hadn't killed off a lot of great characters that we would miss later on. So yeah, I just that season 3 for me is it.
I was gonna say season 3, but now I'll switch for all of those reasons. It's great, but I'll actually go with season 1, and because Godfather 2 is my favorite of the 1 and 2, and 3 doesn't exist as we know. Do not speak of this.
It's
that's their season 8.
Yeah.
But you don't get 2 without 1, right? So I think all of the groundwork for every deliberate and meaningful piece of storytelling that we have seen in the series was done in that first season. It was so well adapted, and I think we undercut that. Everybody's like, well, they had a map. Just because you have a map doesn't mean you're going to do very well with it.
Look how many great
People
books
mess
make
up
bad movies.
adaptations.
I'm looking at you, the Golden Compass. Thank God for his Dark materials. So they had to go back, right? They trashed the pilot and they started again. There is a simplicity, there's a coherence to it. All of the choices add up. All of the character decisions add up. Everything we know of them matters in the end, and the tragedy of Ned's death is deeply, 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 profoundly felt. So I love that season, and I think it is the template that we should all use. Anybody who's a creator, I'm actually not, but if I were, for how to tell a story and how to stay true to your characters and how to commit and be refined and simple and clean. And what's the thing about season 8, and I won't say too much more because we said it all, that is so profoundly disappointing is how messy it is. And how, and sure, we had recycling was the real hero, right? We had water bottles and coffee mugs everywhere. but I think
that was the best,
right? But I think but I think the reason that it was right. Yeah. But I think the reason we're all noticing that and talking about it is because A, it's so we're not noticing the other things, and B, because it's messy. Yeah. And if you think about the scene, and it is the scene where Tyrion says to Jon, "Does that sound like a woman who's done conquering?" And that may not be the exact line. John's only response, if you were being coherent, is, "I don't know because I don't speak Valyrian." Mm-hmm. And Tyrion, notably, in this season, an episode before, doesn't speak it very well. So they can't have known what she said. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't matter because they just want to get to Star Wars.
Yeah.
Right. But anyway, season 1 was amazing. It was really good.
Yeah.
It was,
we can all agree.
And I love Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
So good.
It's still real good.
I really do. Oh boy.
No,
I'm hiding from internet.
No, it's true.
We can criticize the things we love.
Exactly.
We should not love blindly. Yeah. It is okay to have issues with something.
I'm starting a petition now, Terri.
about criticizing the things you love. Listen, I have a Game of Thrones tattoo on my ankle. There is no escaping this fandom for the rest of my life.
I'm wearing a $10 Game of Thrones t-shirt from Target. That's my commitment.
There you go. Laura.
I agree with both. I go back and forth between season 3 and season 4 a lot, and I think season 4 squeaks ahead for me because season 3, even though I love it and I love the Red Wedding and and the kind of the Hound and Arya stuff, but I think that it just became too dark in a way, all of the Theon torture stuff with Ramsay just rubbed me the wrong way, and I was like, we just seem to be wallowing in darkness and grotesquerie here.
In season 3?
In season 3 and season 5, both of those.
Season 3 did begin the on-screen.
You're let's reel it back. This is unnecessary. You're just being disgusting for the sake of being disgusting. And I do love the Ramsay wiggling the sausage and all of that. There are moments that are great, even though they're disgusting. But season 4 has a little less of that problematic stuff. It also has the Purple Wedding. It also has the introduction of Oberyn Martell, the Mountain and the Viper,
and the goodbye of Oberyn Martell.
But what an impact of a character in one season.
It introduced Dawn in such a memorable way, which they then messed up later. But you kind of had such an excitement about the potential of Dawn.
This is what Dawn is. It's going to be the best place ever.
This is going to be so cool.
Spin up.
And the fact that a lot of that through line of that season is all the fallout from Joffrey's death and the trial and the falling drama and the escalating tension of that, and how it's so beautifully paid off and tied up in a neat bow while also being deliciously disgusting and messy. I loved it.
I'm jumping ahead a little bit so I don't have to say what my favorite seasons are because we've talked about them all already. But the other thing, mine is 3, but the thing I love about 4, because I also go back and forth, you mentioned the trial, but gosh, if Tyrion's trial in The Laws of Gods and Men is not the best acted sequence in this show, then I don't know what is.
What
Like,
a speech.
to this
All-time great. Yeah.
Oh, like to this, like I didn't murder Joffrey, but I wish I did. Yeah, like it's so good, and him just fully just committing, like because his when Shay comes out,
It's
so
heartbreaking.
good.
You just feel it.
It's
You
so
feel everything,
good.
and it's so meticulously plotted that you understand where all these characters are coming from. You feel it. You feel
Jamie's
the
giving
emotion.
him this lifeline out, and he can't take it.
And him just saying, like, I wish you all could just die and burn. So.
And then they did.
I'm gonna go back.
Just had to
And then he
wait
was
4
sad
years.
about it.
And then he was sad about it. He got what he wanted.
Tyrion.
Joshua.
As far as least favorite season, which was the one with all the Tyrion torture? I'm sorry, not Tyrion. Theon torture.
Season 3.
Season 3. I hate that.
Yeah.
But season 3, listening to Eric talk about it, I'm like, there's so much
I mean,
good
I
stuff.
agree
in
that
there.
that is my least favorite part of the season, but yeah.
I willfully forget it happened.
Yeah. Also, 2 is like really depressing, but that's getting because all the horrible events of 1 are felt in 2, so that's always like a low point for me.
Isn't that all the Stannis stuff too?
Oh yeah, remember
The
Stannis?
Battle of Blackwater. Yeah.
But I actually will agree with Roth that season 1 is just a gem. It's so great to watch because it's just so many things we don't have anymore. We're all in that season of, well, obviously Sean Bean's performance as Ned Stark was just so good. And he's such a great introduction to the world of Game of Thrones because he's sort of like kind of the honorable guy who tries to do the right thing, then you're sort of stereotypical hero in air quotes. But as he enters the world of Game of Thrones and tries to get involved with the politics, he sees that that's very much not how this world works. Like, it's not going to go that way. And then we're given that very rude awakening at the end when he gets his head chopped off. And right, that was such a powerful moment. But also, this is the season where we had, again, Arya getting her sword lessons, right? And Tyrion just trying to weasel his way out of like prison and all these things, and like just how we could just start one scene in just the worst scenario possible, but watch him manipulate events and people into where he's suddenly on top and has the advantage, right? That was so great seeing him.
Him and Kat. That was
Yes.
all interesting.
Oh yes. And
Remember
just,
Catelyn?
yes.
How great was she?
Yeah, we haven't talked much about Kat at all, but yeah, she was so important in that first season. So there's just so many great, awesome things. Remember the rivalry between Ned Stark and Jaime, and how they would, like, I don't show off because when I what does that say to him? Like, I don't fight in the tourneys because then you can see what I can do. Like, I want it to be a surprise.
Remember Baratheon?
Oh yeah.
And Jaime, by the way, being pretty much a villain in season 1, but I love the touch where he gets pissed at one of his men for slicing Ned's ankle.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to beat him.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, it's like the guy comes up behind him and it's like not fair.
The death of Jory, oh my God, and all of Ned's men.
Jory.
That's one of the most gut-wrenching moments for me when
Remember
they.
the opening in the pilot too, with Will, the defector from the Night's Watch that introduces us to the White Walkers and
And all those symbols that meant
Micah, the
nothing.
baker's boy.
There's the harshness of that world. Yeah, like this guy is poor. He's running for his life. He's coming to warn you, and you're beheading him.
Yeah.
You're our hero.
This world
Yeah.
sucks.
This world
the man who
sucks.
passes the sentence must swing the sword, though.
I did just call Ned a stereotypical hero, but that's actually a huge flaw in Ned, and he's not the best guy ever.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that
he
is
sticks to
rigid.
the rules.
Yeah.
Sticks to the rules,
And
to
those
his
are the
own-
rules, yeah.
But even then, that's since when is following the rules always good? How many stories
it's
are about how they
It's
fuck
not.
it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, so you were agreeing with me?
I'm agreeing with you.
You see that with Jon Snow, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
or
Except he
she's my
breaks
queen.
the
It's
rules.
like, it's blind allegiance to anything will get you killed.
But he breaks, so he says, "You're my queen, my once and future queen," as he kills her. So I would say he's just dumb
That
for
was
other
his
reasons.
fourth time saying that, though. He meant it the first 3.
And I will say, just to bring it all home, the book 1, when that ended, of just, then the world once again heard the sounds of dragons, something along those lines. That was just so beautifully brought to life, and it just brought an amazing end to that season in such the perfect way. And I still remember all my friends who had never read the books or anything just saying like, "Oh my God, I played that last scene with Daenerys coming out and she has the dragons like over and over and over again," because I was just like, it's so fun and so cool. And that really is, just a great moment that day. built to properly and paid off.
And I'll even say watching it again, because watching the first couple of seasons, the frankly gratuitous nudity is very gratuitous.
Yes.
There's some scenes where they cut from sex scene to sex scene that I'm just like, guys. And so even with Emilia Clarke, obviously, is very naked in a lot of the early stuff, but it still actually does work as bookending the season. That in the first episode, she's like naked and vulnerable, and her creepy brother's grabbing her breast and being all nasty. But at the end, she's naked with like such power, and like she is completely like everyone is like bowing to her. It's just that worked very well.
Also, she gained her power by a total revenge trip of like, I'm gonna hear your screams. No, you won't. Oh no, I will. And then she did.
It's telegraphed from the beginning. But I will also, we were talking about Pedro Pascal's The Red Viper, like being someone who didn't even last a full season but left such an indelible mark on the show. Khal Drogo in season 1. What an imposing figure for Jason Momoa, and like still one of the most recognizable characters on the show to this day.
See, guys, we do love this show.
Now we're doing just like the Chris Farley thing of like, remember?
I have something to say.
Wait, are we doing least favorite? Or?
Both.
Oh, okay. Least favorite 8. I got that out of the way. Favorite. Well, I love 1 because it introduced me to this world and got me hooked. I think season 4 ultimately, because at that point in time, I thought I knew all the tricks of it, and that was the season where the bad guys finally started to lose. Like, I hadn't read the book, so I was surprised when Joffrey died, episode 2.
Episode 2,
yeah. And so, like, for me, it was like, okay, they still have some surprises left. And then the further kind of evolution, I believe, right, of Arya and the Hound's relationship. And then, Oberyn Martell, and he was so cool in that fight, and just... like, he made a splash. But no, I think that season was the one where like that was literally their midway point, and where the show really could have started going downhill, and that they managed to keep surprising me and keeping me on the edge of my seat and everything. And so I guess season 4. Although I love all the first 4, but season 4.
Same, I think, season 3 is my favorite pretty much for the same reasons that Eric detailed, though I agree, I don't love the Theon stuff, love the Oberyn Martell and many things in season 4. Dislike season 8, though I think I'm numb to it right now. Still say Beyond the Wall in season 7 is the worst episode of Game of Thrones.
Correct.
I do like your Twitter rants about that episode.
Ooh, and they'll never stop. Don't worry, everyone. But to me, my least favorite season is season 5. It clearly marked a turning point in terms of pacing. It was so horribly
That's the Dorne
dark.
one, right?
It's the one that they botched Dorne. It's the one that Sansa and Ramsay's storyline just goes. I thought that Arya's very long storyline at the House of Black and White just kind of dragged on, and there was no glimmer of light, at least as I'm reflecting on it now, that stands out to me. I think it was. To me, that really is the turning point. And I talked about it earlier. It's the time when the show had to pass the book and make this choice. And, you can feel it stretching, but also changing things and changing the pacing. And that, to me, is kind of the beginning of the end. And from there, we're, on the downward slope of this roller coaster after this really incredible climb up. Chaos is a ladder. I look back at season 5, and I'm like, gosh, this is a season I never want to watch again, where I do think, even in season 8, there are sequences that are so jaw-droppingly stunning, even if they don't make a lick of sense, like the Battle of the Bastards.
Do you think season 5 gets a bit of a pass because of the gimmick of killing off Jon in the end? Because that's what the thing that everyone thought.
No, that was even more annoying.
I hated it in the
Actually, I remember being just so annoyed because we had to go along with this pretense of pretending he wasn't coming back.
All of the actors were like, no,
it
he's
was
dead.
really
Everyone's
annoying.
like, but is
and
he
EW's
dead?
waiting with their cover story with he's back. I'm
all
like,
of those
it was just,
switches.
it was so annoying because none of us bought it. Not because the books we didn't have any information. It just was like, they are not narratively taking him out of the story right now, guys. And you trying to go this hard on, no, he's gone. Just felt like over the
top.
top.
He never cut his hair and he never shaved his beard in real life. So they really wanted to throw us off.
Then he showed up in Belfast and ruined it, and everyone saw it.
I don't want to end things on completely a down note, and I wanted to spend more time for us we've all been covering the show for so long. We are here because we are passionate about the show. You guys created this show because we are passionate about the show, and we've carried on your legacy. Hopefully very well in the years since, because we love this show. Many of us have been covering it from the beginning. I wanted to give everyone an opportunity to kind of say their favorite memory, and if you do have a short version, please do share. But to me, the thing that is most special about this show, that has led to us talking so long on this episode alone, and we could go for many more hours, is the way it's brought people together, is the fact that it is the last great water cooler show. Like, I have had so many amazing conversations online, made new friends, talked to complete strangers, bonded with people who I'd never met before in real life at random bars, wherever, over a shared love of Game of Thrones, over the speculating and the theorizing. And like, part of the biggest disappointment to me that it's over, and the reason I keep bringing up the books, because they're not over, is the fact that like this conversation seems to have come to a close. And I loved the years that this was like a living, breathing franchise, and getting to feel like you were a part of it. And yes, we didn't write it, but we had some sense of ownership about it because we loved it so deeply, even in our criticisms and in our praising of it. And to me, that is like the most special thing about Game of Thrones, and getting to talk with all of you about it and everyone else who we've chatted with online. That to me will always be the case, regardless of, and one of my favorite parts of this whole experience, regardless of how we feel about season 8.
Yeah, I will say, basically the last 10 years, because even though it was 8 seasons, it was basically a decade of our
development.
It does remind me a little bit of the MCU in that, it's been the larger part of my career here at IGN. And when I started covering these things, nobody in the mainstream gave a damn. You were a geek for doing that. Now geekiness is the mainstream. I go out to dinner, a bar, and I hear the people next to me.
You eat dinner at the bar, for the record. Yeah.
I do, yeah, and they have a great happy hour. But I will hear the people next to me who are not geeks, and they are talking in the minutia of Game of Thrones and the MCU, your barista, everything, and I'm like, my God, everything. Like, they drank the Kool-Aid too, man. It's everywhere now. So I think it's been amazing to kind of watch this stuff become our pop culture. It's not
our culture. It's
it's not, and when everything is geeky, nothing is geeky. Everything is anything now is kind of palpable, is possible for a show where you can kill off main characters, or if, like in the movies with the MCU, you can have this whole interlocking thing. So for me, it was just a really amazing kind of time to work in this industry and see things change, and to go from being, even IGN, being a site that was kind of on the outside looking in, to now being like, the stuff that we cover is mainstream, and we have kind of, we've grown too. And so, it's just been a really fascinating kind of journey. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that these things never end. It's like, Game of Thrones will be back in a spinoff. It's Star Wars. People still talk about that. Like, it might be over and it might not have ended the way everyone would have liked, but it's not going to go away anywhere,
Yeah, I will say, when I think of Game of Thrones, I think of how I was first exposed to it, which was when I think I had to have been 13 at the time, and my dad was tired of me rereading the Harry Potter books, and he's like, here, try this other successful, I hear it's good, fantasy book, and then he gave me the first Game of Thrones book, not knowing, I think, of all, the language, violence, rape, incest,
There's no novel MA.
Yeah, he must have not. But he gave that to me. Let's try this instead. And immediately enraptured. And when I got to the end with the dragons coming out and everything, I just remember turning back to the beginning and reading it again, because I was like, this is one of the best things I've ever, ever read. And little Joshua blowing his mind. And then from reading that, Harry Potter first is what inspired me to start writing myself, but Game of Thrones showed me but this is what you can really do. It was leveling up, and so it inspired me to level up my game and really get into writing as a teenager and into school, and entering short story contests, and then majoring in English in college. So really, and then now writing for IGN and everything.
About Game of Thrones.
About Game of Thrones. All come full circle, people.
More than half your life.
It really it's been so integral to my DNA that I'm just so grateful for Game of Thrones. And for a lot of people, the show is everything. They didn't read the books or anything like that. But for me, the show has always been, oh, that's nice. So that's an interesting, take on what happened, but I've always been like a book person. So if people who are super upset with the show, how that ended, really, I'm still waiting for the books to end. Like, I think that will be the true ending of Game of Thrones for me.
And then George can disappoint us all over if he wants.
Well, we'll see.
Two different disappointments.
You want to see disappointment?
It'll be like, I went extra long, guys. This is what you get when you want more material. For me, I'm the same as you, Terry. It's the community. It's like being able to talk about it with my mom. Like, my mom and I watch Game of Thrones and talk about like the nerdy details and stuff. Like, I never would have thought that would happen. There are a lot of boobs and sex. There have been some awkward moments over the years, but it all works. But like, and just all of us, like, we've been to so many conventions. We've been to premieres together. We've like just watching the show together week to week this season, just all being able to react with each other and react in real time and just have those nerdy conversations that we'd always be having anyway, but you know, getting to have
camera.
them. Exactly.
It
like,
really
it's
was
just
the friends we made along the way.
yeah, it's like this show has brought so many people together all around the world, and that's just the most precious thing.
Brothers and sisters.
Yeah, all hands around the world, hands across America.
Yeah, cats and dogs. I would agree that it really is the opportunity to connect with all these different people. And also, I like fan fiction and theorizing, and I really love that aspect to what we do. Not everybody does. Some people want to stick to the text, and that's cool too. But that's been one of my favorite things about the show, is that there are so many opportunities to go, okay, I heard this idea that there's an island, you know, and it's that I don't think is gone for us. Right. I will say one of the things about the unresolved threads is that door is still very much open for us to unleash the krakens of our imagination on and still come together and still like co-create this world in some sense in our imaginations. And I don't think that'll ever stop, because when you have lore this rich and this deep, that opportunity is always there for you. For me, the ultimate meaning of the show is it's this poetic rendering of everyone getting exactly what they want. You know, and the cost of that. Sansa wanted to be queen. Arya wanted to be free, to live as she was. That's not me, this is. Jon wanted to be legitimized. Bran wanted to fly and see things from this very heightened point of view. Every single person, Daenerys wanted the throne, and her last act was to touch it. So I think everyone did get what they want, and I think there is something beautiful and circular about that, but that circle remains open in a lot of ways. So that's cool.
A lot of what you guys were saying, coalescing, the community aspect, the career aspect. Me personally, as geeky as I've always been, never really liked like traditional medieval times fantasy. Wasn't a big Lord of the Rings fan. Former IGN writer, I know. Former IGN writer Travis Fickett would always talk about these books, starting with Game of Thrones I should read, and I would say, no, I don't like that kind of stuff. He would tell me, Peter Dinklage should play Tyrion Lannister, and I would say, I don't know who Tyrion Lannister is. And then, when it all came together, I was looking back on some of my first coverage of this show at IGN this week, and it was kind of amazing. I'd forgotten an IGN reader, and I think he probably listened to Channel Surfing, the IGN TV podcast, sent Matt Fowler and I the first book, each of us. He sent 2 copies because we've been talking about how I guess we got to read these books before this show comes. Per Schneider, our boss, is really excited about this. and so the fact that like a reader sent us the first books, which we were going to get to, but he helped us get to it quicker, was awesome. And then just seeing it sort of snowball, and the fact that I did love it, that because I had been someone who goes, I don't like stuff set in that kind of era. And with dragons and all that stuff, and I was like, no, this is awesome. The characters are great. It doesn't matter. So it kind of sold me on that type of fantasy. And also, I do want to give my quick, try to keep it brief, Dragons on the Wall history lesson.
Yes,
which is just I was looking back, and it also went with IGN growth and kind of doing post shows at all. And I look back, and season 1, Matt Fowler and Eric Morrow did like a post episode video each week, Untitled. And then season 2, Matt Fowler and I did On the Throne, which then Roth, you and I did in season 3. Season 4, we went back to No Name again. I don't know what was going on there.
No name.
A show has no name. And then season 5, we had 2 episodes of Watchers on the Wall, and then the 3rd episode became Dragons on the Wall with this very lovely logo and graphic. So that was really kind of cool to see, even that as IGN was growing and we were doing more, and our bosses were very excited about the show, but clearly our readers were. I mean, I have no idea what the traffic stats are now, but I remember that the Reigns of Castamere was just the most insane traffic to see on a piece of just a TV episode review, and just see that we all got it though. It's not like I was like, I don't get what those people are caring about. Like everyone was just on board. This was like a communal thing. We talk about how it's going to be very hard for another TV show in this era to recapture the we're all watching it together thing.
We said that about Lost too.
We said it.
I think
we're right now.
But now, now we're like 10 streaming services more.
It's like weekly shows, so just a lot more
hard.
rare.
It's going to be more difficult. Not impossible.
We're going to grow old never having seen great shows because there's going to have been so many programs and so little time to catch up on everything.
I do think, having gone through the Harry Potter gamut as well, which was very important to me on a personal level, Joshua, in a way similar to you, and it ended, and I was just left with this hole where I was.
You and I, Terri.
know. Deathly Hallows
For audio-only listeners, they have Deathly Hallows tattoos on their wrists.
Yeah, on the same arm, on the same general wrist area. And Game of Thrones replaced that for me, and I still kind of feel this whole, even though the books aren't done, there's going to be prequels, there's going to be more. Like, George R. R. Martin is clearly invested in this world. I have faith there will be something else that brings us all together again and makes us so excited and so passionate and love and hate and wail and yell and petition and what have you. And I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Do it all over again.
King of the North.
Yeah.
King of the North.
Queen of the North.
And now, with that, our watch has actually ended. Thank you, everyone, for joining us over the years on IGN's Game of Thrones show, Dragons on the Wall, and the many others that came before. And thank you, Eric and Roth, for joining us.
Thank you.
Where you are no longer at IGN, where can people find you on the internet?
Fandom.com.
People can find us at fandom.com and also Fandom Entertainment on YouTube and Screen Junkies on YouTube. We're also on internets. We're at the Twitters and the stuff.
They're down below you. The general area post magic. They aren't holding up little signs.
We'll be releasing the honest trailer for Game of Thrones.
I am looking forward to it. Now, of course, for more on Game of Thrones, because yes, there will be more coverage, we want you to check out our comparison for how Daenerys' vision in the throne room back in those early seasons compared to the finale, as well as the Game of Thrones cast saying goodbye and thank you to the fans. And even though this series may be over, don't you worry, my sweet summer children, because there is plenty more Game of Thrones coverage to come, thanks to the upcoming prequel and the books, should they ever be released. So for all things Game of Thrones, TV, and beyond, be sure to like and subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch. Thanks, guys.